Welcome to video 3 of our Introduction to Note-Taking Workshop video series. If you haven't done so already, you may want to consider locating, downloading, and printing the PDF entitled Introduction to Note-Taking Workshop Handout to follow along a little bit better. Let's go ahead and begin. In this video, we're going to start by talking about our second note-taking method, the Cornell Method. The Cornell Method is actually a system for taking, organizing, and reviewing notes, and was devised by Cornell University professor Walter Pock in the 1940s. This method is actually for mastering information and not simply recording facts. Each step of the Cornell Method process prepares you for the next step. The Cornell Method typically uses a system that divides the paper into 3 or 4 different sections. Follow along with me in the logo in the top right-hand corner of your screen or on page 3 of your printed out handout. Section 1 is considered the title section and is where you're going to want to write down the overall topic being covered in the lecture or the section of book that you may be reading, the date, and the name of the class. While this is not an official section of the classic Cornell method, it is highly recommended in order for you to stay organized. Section 2 is called the note-taking column and is the meat and potatoes of the Cornell method. This section should be around 70% of your page width or in about 6 inches from the right-hand side on a standard sheet of lined paper. This is where you're going to write down all your main notes while you're listening to your class lecture or while you're reading your book. In this section, you're going to be writing details, facts, figures, formulas, dates, definitions, examples, any pictures you want to draw, anything that you find relevant and important to remember. When you're writing things down in this section, you should use telegraphic sentences, which are sentences using around 5 words or less, like you might find in a telegram, or abbreviations, again, ones that you'll remember later in order to save space and allow for faster note-taking. In this section, you should also skip lines between any ideas so you can come back later and fill in more detail. Once your class is over or your lecture is over, or even you're done reading your textbook, and you've already written out all the information you found important in Section 2 of the Cornell Method, you now come to Section 3, what we call the Q column or the recall column. This section should be set up on the left-hand side of your paper if you're following along with the logo in the top right-hand corner of your screen or page 3 of your printed out handout, and should be around 30% of your page width or in from the left-hand side about 2.5 inches on a standard sheet of lined paper. Here, you will review and clarify the main notes you wrote in Section 2. Next to each main note or topic in Section 2, in Section 3, you're going to write keywords, cues, questions to be answered later when you're reviewing your notes, comments, anything that might make that information from Section 2 easier to remember. Formulating and writing questions here should become habit. Writing questions help you better understand meanings, strengthens memorization, highlights relationships, and establishes continuity. These questions you write in Section 3 also, by the way, become a great way for you to study later. While you could fill in some of the Q column during your lecture or during your active reading session, most of this section should be completed after the end of the lecture or after you're done reading your textbook. The reason for this is that Section 3 is summarizing or creating questions for better understanding of the information you wrote in Section 2. Without a complete picture of the lecture or the section you're reading in your textbook, it's difficult to fully summarize or encapsulate everything found in Section 2. Finally, we come to the fourth section of the Cornell method, the summary section. This section should be around 2 inches up from the bottom of your page and is where you'll give a general summarization of all the notes from the entire page of notes. Your summary should be brief, around 5 to 7 lines, and be written in your own words so that you can clearly understand it later when you're reviewing your notes. Section 4 should be completed as soon as possible at the end of the lecture or after you're done reading your textbook, but no more than 24 hours later. After about 24 hours, your memory can begin to deteriorate, so you want to make sure that Section 4 is completed while the information is relatively fresh in your mind. Let's now talk about some advantages and disadvantages to the Cornell note-taking method. Some advantages are the main ideas of your notes are easy to see since there's an entire section dedicated to this, which is Section 2. And if you've left the intended space in Section 2 in between each main idea, you can go back anytime and add more missing ideas or details. Also, it incorporates a built-in method for deeper understanding and forces you to ask questions that you might not otherwise ask in Section 3. Some disadvantages to the Cornell method. One can be that it's difficult to put together for some people who have never used it before. It does require a lot more writing than, say, the outline method, and it does take discipline and practice to get better at the technique. Here is a great example of someone taking notes using the Cornell method of the same exact lecture we saw earlier of peanut butter and jelly sandwiches. As you can see, the person taking these notes utilized the 4 different sections of the Cornell method. They drew first an off-center or offset eye on the page, dividing the paper into these sections. Section 1, of course, is across the top, the title section, showing that this lecture was from an Advanced Culinary 301 class. They wrote what the lecture was about, peanut butter and jelly sandwiches, and the date of the lecture. Section 2, the main body of the notes, on the right-hand side of the offset eye, is where they wrote all of their important facts, figures, main ideas. And to the left of that section, Section 3, is the Q column or the recall column, where the person wrote down questions related to the facts and figures. Again, this section will come in very handy for this individual later when studying the information to see if they've retained all the facts, figures, and information from Section 2. And at the bottom of this page, the summary section summarizes everything found above it. If you compare this visual to the example of the outline method someone took earlier, you will see all the information is exactly the same. It is just presented in a different way. If you are following along with your handout, this example can be found on page 4. And the helpful thing with a handout is you can actually put this page 4 side by side with page 2 of your handout and see the differences between the outline method and the Cornell method. That's all for video 3. To continue, please go now to video 4 of our Introduction to Note-Taking workshop video series.